The case far from over, especially after Robert Coaster originally pleaded not guilty to 35 charges. Today, he changed that plea to guilty to 23 sexual misconduct counts for raping and molesting 4 teenage girls, all during photography sessions.
Are these your initials in each of the applicable boxes, sir?
Holding up 4 pages of a change of plea form for 52-year-old photographer Robert Coaster, convicted of 23 counts of sexual misconduct against 4 teenage girl models in North County, San Diego.
Yes, Your Honor.
In the Vista courtroom, the judge read each graphic charge.
You did unlawfully engage in an act of sexual intercourse with Jane Doe number 4, a 16-year-old minor.
The sexual acts were reported to have occurred during November 2018, including unlawful penetration and willful touching of intimate parts of minors.
A child 15 years of age. You were at least 10 years older than the child.
To each count,
How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
the judge entered all 23 guilty pleas to the explicit crimes the deputy district attorney detailed.
Rape of an unconscious 16-year-old girl.
Coaster faces more federal charges and counts in Oregon, where there are more victims.
Involves 4 additional victims separate and apart from ours for different conduct.
Some of the young victims and their families were present in court.
The victims in this case showed extraordinary strength and courage to come forward and speak out against this man who victimized them when he was placed in a position of trust by their parents.
Coaster will be sentenced on October 25th. He faces 25 years in prison, and after that sentencing, he will then be transferred to federal court to face more charges.